Welcome to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. It's Sunday, May 25th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. It is day 597 of the war. Hi, Jacob.
Hi, Jessica. Good to be with you again.
It's good to be together today. It is the start of a new week, and the IDF has said that all of its standing army infantry and armored brigades are now deployed to the Gaza Strip as Israel prepares to further intensify its offensive against Hamas. We'll discuss the latest regarding the ongoing offensive, including claims yesterday from Gaza that an Israeli strike in Khan Yunis killed 9 children of one family. There were also statements by released hostages about the fears engendered by Israeli strikes while they were still in captivity. We'll also talk about a possible shift in aid operations in Gaza and political comments made by Israel's ambassador to the U.S., Yechiel Leiter. Stay with us.
Jews have to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time. Thank you, Mr. President, for Jerusalem. No, thank you for banning Arabs. His message on anti-Semitism is a good message. Trump is saying all the right things, and he may even be doing the right things, but for the wrong reasons. It's a dilemma for us, but I think we still have to stand up for the institutions, for due process, even if the wrong things that he's doing help us in the long term.
I just don't see how they help us at all, because I
Well,
think in
consequences.
the long run,
There needs to be consequences. You can go out, you can march with a Palestinian flag. God bless you. That's fine. But if you use that flag to stop a Jewish students to go to class or beat them up, that's not freedom of speech. There needs to be consequences.
Okay, Jacob, let's first tackle the Gazan claims that are still ongoing right now. 9 children killed by an IDF strike, appearing to be the children of one couple, a pair of Gazan doctors. The IDF says that they are looking into this claim. What can you tell us about it?
Right, so this seems to be a bit more corroborated than just a simple Hamas-run Health Ministry statement. We have testimony from the family themselves, doctors in the hospital, and others who the family's been identified as the Najjar family. These are 2 doctors who were working in a hospital in Khan Yunis, and the mother at the time was actually on site when some of her children were brought in, charred and almost unrecognizable. Really a pretty graphic scenes from the hospital. There was one surviving child. That's at least those are the reports right now. But definitely while you have dozens of casualties, it seems like every night, according to the Hamas-run Health Ministry. This is definitely, I think, we're seeing also the toll it's having on children specifically. The health ministry got to take what they say with a grain of salt, and they don't differentiate between civilians and combatants. But it is worth noting that their reporting has become at least there's a Washington Institute analysis done by Gabriel Epstein a few days ago that looked at some of their reporting and noted that there's been a lot of improvements, that they're relying more on the hospital morgue system and less on simply family reporting of deaths. And they've even put together the Hamas Health Ministry, actually on, I believe, Thursday it was, a list of 16,503 children who they say have been killed in the war. And it gives ID numbers, date of birth, name, etc. So these are things actually that Israel has access to the Gazan population registry and could refute this if it's not true. There haven't been those kinds of any refuting at this stage by Israeli authorities. But in general, I think it does seem to be that even if we're talking still roughly 50% of the population, 50% of the casualties are believed to be men, and then you could argue military-age men that are maybe combatants. We're still looking at similar numbers of women and children as well, and elderly. So I think that's important to note. I think the strike is definitely making headlines also in international media. I saw that CNN covered it and others.
It's juxtaposed against the hostage protests and more political protests last night, which of course were in many different cities. And in Tel Aviv, the largest protest was the anti-government protest. And next to that was a silent protest of Israelis holding pictures of slain Gazan children that seems to have grown in size over the last few weeks. And at the same time, at the hostage protest last night, freed, released hostage Naama Levy spoke about really the mortal fears and how close she came to death during IDF strikes while she was still in captivity. And that's also juxtaposed next to statements that have been made by recently released hostage Edan Alexander about that he also almost came close to death during IDF strikes while he was in captivity. So different issues, but essentially all around IDF strikes in Gaza. So take us through that, if you would.
Yeah, I think this has been a common, I don't know, talking point, but a line that you'll hear a lot from released hostages,
Right.
that the strikes have been something that were really the part of the most scary part of their time in captivity. Obviously, what Israel or Prime Minister Netanyahu will argue is that these strikes, this military pressure, is what creates the conditions for an eventual deal. But I think how the hostages' families see it is that if you're not actually trying to get that deal, or you're making so many adding conditions that make the deal really still hard to move forward with, that this military pressure is only just risking the lives of hostages and not actually advancing a war aim. The Edan Alexander story is quite harrowing. If
Yeah.
you remember, several weeks ago, I think Hamas issued a statement saying it had lost contact with Edan Alexander's captors, and that was, I think it was on. I'm not going to give a specific date. I think it was several weeks ago. And at that point, we didn't really get information of what happened since, but President Trump talked about how the thought was that Edan Alexander was no longer alive. And now that he's was thankfully released in that so-called gesture of goodwill by Hamas a couple weeks ago, we now have him giving testimony talking about what happened on that day when Hamas said that they lost touch with his captors. There was a strike on a tunnel where he was being held, and the tunnel basically started collapsing, and he was injured, was rushed to another tunnel, as I think there were all sorts of gases that he was exposed to, very close to suffocating, he said. Really, I think he talks about being saved actually by one of the other captors, who one lost his life, the other managed to save him, but he also managed to just I guess, as the tunnel was collapsing, get out of
Right.
the way. And really had to dig with his own hands, basically, in to safety. A pretty wild story that he shares in the Ynet news site just over the weekend. And I think it highlights again that the IDF says it's very certain when it carries out strikes that there aren't hostages in the area, but there's obviously hostages are constantly bethere's no 100% certainty when these strikes are being carried out. I think there's just uh, I think Yair Golan's comments maybe highlighted a little bit more about what's going on in Gaza and
Yair Golan, the head of the opposition party, the Democrats, right?
right. And he said, I think a few days ago, he got a lot of flack for saying Israel. I think he says he was referring to the government, but it shouldn't be killing kids in Gaza as a hobby. I think the particular frustration was on the use of the word hobby. But there are clearly, these strikes are very lethal. We're seeing it on Saturday with this family, and it's not just him. I don't know if it really sparked conversation on what's happening in Gaza, more a little bit on his words, but even Channel 13 had a report about they spoke with Israeli Air Force members who said that they're coming back from the command centers after its nights of strikes and feeling a little bit less comfortable with some of the strikes that they're carrying out. That's something that's, I think, should be raising alarm bells. You had Yoram Sheffer, who's the former head of the Air Force, talking about this as well, and actually deciding that he's going to join the Democrats' party just days after Yair Golan's comments. I think there's definitely now a little bit more of a reckoning of whether or not is there a certain number of civilian casualties that may be crossing a line. I think that's what we're seeing from these statements, definitely from people more on the left side of the spectrum. But it seems to be trickling further because the more and more people. Again, there was a poll on Channel 12 on Friday showing that a majority of Israelis feel that this war is being extended for political considerations and not for either for the hostages or even for victory against Hamas. That feeling is just that this is for Netanyahu trying to just maintain in power. That's a majority of Israelis that think that. That's pretty shocking.
Right. Okay. Jacob, let's take a quick break. We're going to turn to what's happening, the latest in terms of aid in Gaza, and some statements made by the ambassador to the U.S., Yechiel Leiter. So stay with us.
What surprised you the most discovering about Jewish life in the United States?
I think it's the pride. I think I was envy of that pride. Just being proud, being a proud Jew. It's something that I never even contemplated. I was just an Israeli. I think the fact that, in Israel, we have all sort of sectors in society. You kind of grow up with your kind. I hate that. The fact that I don't know a lot about my Jewish life and I need to go abroad just to understand that. It's something so messed up and how we grew up here. It's just, I think, once it got political to be Jewish in Israel, it made me kind of push away from that. Once I got to LA, once I got just being with my daughters abroad, just understanding what we are, my heritage, where we come from, our story, our values. It took me a long time. It took me a long time to get there.
You have been reporting in an ongoing sense about the tactics and the ways of getting aid into Gaza, the issues around it. And now there seems to be this other switch that's happening in which Israel will let aid groups that are operating in Gaza remain in charge of non-food assistance while leaving food distribution to another group. So tell us where we are in terms of this, because of course it does seem like every week they're trying to figure out ways of making this operate more smoothly. That seems to be what it's about.
Right. So we had this 11-week basically blockade. The goal was to try to squeeze Hamas, feeling that it was stealing the aid, but that led to real dire situation in Gaza. And Israel, I think, was pushed by the U.S. and even by the IDF. I think there were people who were warning the political echelon that you needed to reopen the border and allow aid back in. So that's what started happening last week. But now the goal is that this was only going to be an interim scenario where you had the existing mechanisms of the various UN groups like the World Food Program being the ones to deliver aid. But now that Israel's trying to move over to this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation that was founded just several months ago, this American company that's being run by Jake Wood, who's a former Marine and a humanitarian. And he is trying to get this new initiative up and running where you're having these basically bubbles and aid distribution centers that will be distributing aid and trying to make sure that it's going directly to civilians as opposed to just warehouses that make it easier for Hamas to steal. But this program is not ready. It was done very hastily. I think that while there was a lot of ideas for a long time, it wasn't really actualized. And until just about now we're starting to have people on the ground. There's going to be these American security contractors who will be the ones running the logistics at these distribution centers. So the IDF won't be directly distributing aid, but they're just getting into Israel a few days ago. They're not up and running. The sites haven't been all built yet. So there's an understanding that this interim period the hope was that it was going to end by either Saturday or Sunday, but that's not the case. We're still not ready, so the current mechanisms will continue operating. And in addition to that, as you mentioned, you have this letter from Jake Wood, the head of GHF, to Kogat saying that we will focus on food. Yes, that's the goal once we're up and running. When that exactly is, I'm not really sure. I think it was clear when Netanyahu talked about a week from when they reopened the border that it wasn't going to be longer than that. But in the meantime, or even after, once we do get up and running, the non-food items like medicine, we still think that that can be handled by the existing mechanisms, the World Food Program and World Central Kitchen. Other
Mm-hmm.
organizations that are already operating in Gaza will be in charge of will allow aid to go in through existing mechanisms through the border, and they'll be the ones distributing those kinds of things to hospitals and elsewhere. I guess there's less of a concern regarding that being stolen by Hamas. There's still a lot of questions about GHF, about its funding, about, I think, whether or not it can get any support from other aid groups, which will be very important, and just the lack of distribution sites that it has that forces Gazans to be traveling great lengths to get to them. So those, I think, GHF is going to really have to answer a lot of those questions in the coming days in order to get the trust from other groups in order to function, I think, more successfully in Gaza. So we'll have to see if that happens in the next few days or if we're going to be in this interim period for quite a long time.
Jacob, you had spoken a couple of weeks ago about how sort of each chamula, each family grouping in Gaza would have their own representative that would go receive the aid. Do you know anything? Is there any update on that? Is that operational?
So that's the idea of once the GHF
Is
aid
in.
distribution sites are
Mm-hmm.
running. What was the initial concern, and this is because I know there were Israeli officials briefing reporters on this, is that Israel would be deciding which representative would be coming to the site and giving and receiving the aid. But now what the GHF is actually saying, it issued this kind of myths and facts to reporters a couple days ago, saying that actually no, Israel's not going to be involved at all in deciding who gets to
Mm-hmm.
receive the aid, and they're going to be, I guess, keeping their own registry and making sure that nobody is totally simply exempt, regardless of affiliation, they even say, which is pretty noteworthy. But again, we'll have to see what happens once we actually start seeing these distribution sites operating.
Okay. And then switching gears a little bit for a final topic for today. Um, Comments made by Yechiel Leiter, a longtime associate of the Prime Minister's, who is currently the Israeli ambassador to the U.S. He's also a settler activist. Anyway, he was speaking on a more right-leaning podcast and speaking against the Israeli opposition, making very political comments for a diplomat. Tell us what you heard and, if this is making waves.
Yeah, I think it's probably making waves more amongst critics of Netanyahu and Leiter, I guess, who are kind of amongst the same camp. This was an interview
Sure.
on the Prager University podcast, so you're definitely right. Definitely more conservative leaning, which seems to be basically the only places he's been interviewing since getting to Washington. Definitely, I think a trend
Staying
I've been
comfortable.
noticing. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
but I think everything's kind of been normalized in both in the US and Israel, so it wasn't totally shocking to see, but I think the criticism is that this is not typical for a sitting ambassador to be talking politics this directly, and basically criticizing the opposition of libel and saying that the criticism of Netanyahu that he's simply extending the war for political reasons is totally inappropriate and crosses a line. And he really goes hard off after the opposition. He says the extreme left, and that's
Right.
actually running parts of the media. And then he gets more interestingly into the charges against Netanyahu, the different cases against Netanyahu that are still ongoing. And he says he speaks basically like Netanyahu does, talking about how they're crumbling before everyone's eyes, that it's
Mm-hmm.
just a bunch of cigars that he was receiving, and they're not very. What's the big deal that he wanted favorable coverage? Every politician wants
Politician.
favorable coverage. So really very much dismissing those charges and I think getting into topics that you don't typically hear a sitting ambassador, but again, I think a bit of the sign of the times. So that was kind of my take from those parts of the interview.
Any other general comments in terms of everything else that we've been speaking about that he touched on? Obviously, again, as Israel's representative, as Israel's ambassador in the U.S., as we sort of look on another week beginning in this morass of hostages and ongoing war.
Yeah, I thought he shed some light on the Trump emigration plan for Gazans a little bit. And he talked about, first of all, he clarified that nobody is forcing anyone out of Gaza. I think that was an important point for him to stress, that this is not like a deportation plan. On the other hand, I think when it's happening amidst a war, and Netanyahu himself is saying we're flattening every house in Gaza, and therefore there's nowhere else for people to return to but leave the strip, I think it's hard to simply frame it as a simple immigration plan that just is available for anyone to who volunteers to do so. And I think, but he made a point of saying he's was approached by U.S. officials who are frustrated because Jordan hasn't been taking in Gazans, sick Gazans who it had promised to take in.
Right.
There were those 2,000 that the King Abdullah had promised Trump that he would take, and that hasn't happened so much. And basically what Jordan has said in response is that Israel has not been providing assurances that those who leave can return. And actually did speak to one or two Gazans, actually, sorry, I actually did speak to one Gazan from who left the strip in order to do a pilot program in the Far East of work, basically. And he said that those who agreed to leave on this pilot program had to sign a document saying that they might not be able to return. And Leiter actually denies this and says that if you want an assurance, happily we can tell anyone who wants to return is able to do so. But that's not something that actually has been happening, at least on the ground, according to testimony. And I think he makes this point about how Gazans are very industrious people that will do great things in the countries that they move to. So I think he's very set on this idea that we'll be able to just simply move everyone out of the strip. I think that's when Netanyahu's added this war aim of it's not just he's added this condition for ending the war, is that it's implementing Trump's plan. And I think that is what Leiter is busy trying to advance in Washington, even though there hasn't been so much success in getting countries to sign up for this, partially because that there's this feeling that if you're saying that nobody can return and you're talking about building settlements in Gaza and occupying it permanently, then this is not something that we're so comfortable being part of.
Right. And finally, he also does talk about the relationship between Netanyahu and Trump, and furthers that line that there's no problems between them, that they are still seeing things the same way. Right.
Yeah. He talked about it as a relationship. I think he said it was like a tango. That we're dancing together, and sometimes we step on each other's toes. I think he recognized there are differences of opinion on Iran, where I think Israel was surprised about and not happy with the direct talks that the U.S. has been holding, and Syria, the lifting of sanctions that Israel would like the U.S. to be a bit more cautious on. But overall, he says we're definitely on the same page, and I think points to a lot of other examples about Netanyahu being in the White House twice already.
All right, Jacob. Thanks for all those updates. Been good to have you on the daily briefing.
Thanks, Jessica.
And thanks to all of you for listening to the Times Visuals Daily Briefing. Stay tuned for tomorrow's installment. This episode was produced by the Podways, with the video produced by Thomas Gersh. Any comments that you have about this episode or others, drop us an email, podcast@timesvisual.com. Until next time, take care, Shavua Tov, have yourselves a good week and a good day.